Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Making Milestones podcast. Full disclosure, the audio for this one is probably not going to be the greatest. I'm recording this while I'm out and about doing things. And the reason for that is that I had some ideas that I just wanted to share like immediately. And the nature of ADHD is that if I don't share them right now, they're going to be gone forever. And who knows when they'll come back and I'll be able to talk about this again. So I needed to do this now. So I'm just putting on my mobile headphones and talking to you guys while I run errands and probably looking like a weirdo if anyone overhears me. But yeah, I wanted to talk about some things. This is going to be kind of a multifaceted podcast because I think that there are a lot of things that kind of work in tandem in terms of like creating a lot of the problems we see in the horse world and where we need to change areas. So what I wanted to go into is a recent situation that happened at a dressage competition where a horse died after getting loose and galloping around the show park before running into a stone wall. And I'm going to get further into that. Before I get into that, I do need to plug some of my money making ventures because a girl has to eat and save up for the hopeful future farm pipe dream in this economy, right? Anyways, I have an online store having some huge sales on 2023 apparel. I need to clear it all out. Please help me get it out of my storage area. It needs to get reorganized so badly. I have some super good deals. They're being sold at like a loss to me, and like the prices are starting at like just $8 Canadian, which is like $6 US. So you can check that out at shopmilestoneeq.com, or you can look at the links down below in the description of this podcast and see it there. I also have some subscription services, Patreon, where I post tutorials, I do monthly Q&As, behind the scenes, and more. And you can subscribe for as little as $1 a month, or you can get access to all the tutorials and the training stuff like that for, I think it's like around $15 a month. And you can do that at patreon.com/SDEQUUS. And even if you just subscribe for $1, you have access to asking questions for the monthly Q&As, and you get to see a lot of the behind the scenes. It's just not the training tier where you get to see the tutorials and whatnot. Anyways, I also have opened up my Instagram subscriptions for $1 a month, and you can subscribe there for behind the scenes. It's not going to be as heavy in tutorials and whatnot, but it's still good. So you can check all that out. And thank you again for supporting the podcast. So let's just jump into this. I think it was on May 17th that this incident with the dressage horse happened. It was a pre-St. George dressage horse. So it was like an experienced horse who presumably had shown a fair amount, right? And this was after the prize giving ceremony, and the rider was on the horse, and the horse started to have like an anxious response and bolted and got out of control. The rider could not control the horse and then jumped off. And then the horse proceeded to jump over a bunch of the dressage fences and run around the show park at like full speed before eventually running straight into a stone wall by the stables, sliding, falling down, and then fracturing its femur. And it then had to be euthanized. So the reason why I wanted to talk about this is honestly, it's not to point fingers at the rider and be like, this is her fault, because I've seen people that are like, oh, like, if you can't control a horse, why are you at a show? Why did you get off? Honestly, in that situation, when a horse is running around on concrete and stuff, if you truly cannot stop it, there is no point in staying on and then having two casualties. So I actually support that person doing what they thought was best in the moment. And the other thing is, even if it wasn't the best choice, you're panicking. No one really knows how they're going to react in a moment where they're under that much stress or where they don't feel safe and they feel their life is at risk until they do. So even if in theory there's a better way to respond, that's not what I want to focus on, because responding to that event in the moment is negating why it occurred in the first place. So it's less about why these, like what you do in the moment when a horse is already that stressed and reacting that strongly, and more about how can we prevent these things from happening? Why do they happen? Because horses do not bolt and run off like that for no reason. Those type of behavioral issues and dangerous situations do not occur in a vacuum. They are the result of training practices, care practices, environmental stressors, potential pain and underlying health issues that might be adding stressors. It's the result of a series of triggers being stacked until the horse can no longer take it anymore. And then we see these big, dangerous reactions, which are essentially a rebound of all of that nervous energy that the horse had been holding on to and suppressing. And the reason why I want to say suppressing is that a lot of horse training is reliant on suppressing unwanted behaviors. Anytime we just focus on eradicating an unwanted behavior, a quote unquote bad behavior, and don't deal with the cause, especially when using punishment, what we are asking the horse to do is just simply suppress the behavior. We're not providing them with an alternative. We're simply punishing the behavior and saying, don't do that. But we're not looking into why the behavior exists and not giving the horse like an outlet for whatever underlying motivation or need that the behavior is fulfilling. So when you suppress behaviors and the horse is essentially, they lose like a coping mechanism for whatever it is, or like, and a lot of times they'll engage in these behaviors as a means of relieving anxiety or helping them feel safe because they're flight animals. So when you take away their ability to do that, what it does is that they're still going to be feeling all these emotions and all this anxiety, but then they don't have any means of releasing it, and they're just like internalizing it. And the more you punish horses or force them to work through their anxieties, the more they're learning that like how they feel doesn't matter, and they kind of go into this state of learned helplessness where there's not really any point in trying to communicate how you feel with your humans in any big way because they don't listen anyways. If what you're communicating goes in contrast with what the person wants the horse to do, it's not going to be listened to, and there's a high chance of being punished. So they learn to just stop doing that. And now when you stop doing this communication, what it does is it takes away all these earlier warning signs that people could have noticed that would have helped prevent this level of stress and anxiety building up to the point where there's this severe reaction. With that said, there still would have been signs. They're probably just more subdued than like, because like bolting at that speed and running into a stone wall is a huge reaction, right? But I bet if you looked at the horse's face during the reward ceremony, he would have had a stressed face, like tense eyes, and would have been exhibiting some signs of stress, maybe difficulty standing, etc. There would have been signs. It truly just does not simply come out of nowhere. That's a really common thing that people say about horses, where they'll be like, oh, they did this out of nowhere. But what that really means, we need to change the language about that. What it means is I did not notice when this started. It didn't occur out of nowhere because there's always a reason. They don't just do things for no reason. So unless it's like truly like something insane where like a car explodes beside your horse and then they respond, then yeah, it can feel like it occurred out of nowhere. But even in that case, you know what the catalyst for that behavior is, right? It was the car exploding. It didn't happen out of nowhere. The horse didn't just react for no reason. Every time we say that, it just means we didn't understand the reason why the horse reacted. So I think that change in language, like people might think that's being picky and like too rigid or whatever, but it is an important thing to do, because otherwise the other way of doing it is blaming the horse for our lack of ability to understand and interpret their communication. So all that aside, when we shut down horses' ability to communicate with us about their stress, and we don't actually deal with the underlying causes of stress or help them build better emotional resilience so that they don't have stress build as much, we essentially create the very type of environment that these scenarios can occur in. We create it by having a horse who's poorly emotionally regulated, who oftentimes has equipment used to control their stress behaviors and make them more manageable for people, be it a nose chain, a lip chain, a flash nose band, spurs, whips, etc. We use equipment to help make getting them to do what we want them to do easier. We might even use chemical restraints like sedatives and drugs, and it all is fixated on not actually teaching them how to cope with these things that we expect them to do on a repeated basis. And what that then does is that they can't build emotional resilience. For example, if you drug your horse every time you clip them, they're not really learning how to deal with that stressor. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Like I'd rather have someone drug their horse to clip it than like twitch it or manhandle it. So that's just like a single example. Or if you drug your horse for trailering every time, they're not actually learning how to cope. Or a better example would be not drug related, but if you take your horse to shows and they're always really stressed when you get there, and you handle that stress simply by lunging them to the point of exhaustion, they're not actually learning how to calm down in that environment. They're simply being physically exhausted until their body is tired enough that they no longer have a response. Now, that's not always bad to give them an outlet for anxiety like movement. But if that's the sole thing you're doing and you're never actually teaching them to not be scared in that environment, it's a band-aid at best, and it's not actually addressing the underlying causes. So then when you take that horse and you go show it all over the place and continue to further its career as a competition horse without dealing with all of these little stressors that usually start out at the beginning of their education. So for example, being comfortable off property in new environments, or even if they're not comfortable, learning how to deal with stressors in a healthy manner where they are not losing their minds or freaking out or having difficulty coping. And then you have this horse that will then be the show horse that develops behaviors that largely the show horse community will refer to as quirks. But what these quirks typically are is they're stress behaviors because the horse hasn't been taught how to be emotionally resilient and they haven't been taught to be relaxed in the very environment that their entire career is centered around, which doesn't make sense to me. But the reason for this is that people are in a rush. And then the other thing too is that the average horse person, including like really high level trainers, does not have a very good concept of behavioral science. They don't understand learning theory, so they don't even really understand how the methods they're applying are actually working or why punishment is behavioral suppressant and why it's not good. So because they have that lack of understanding, it makes it a lot harder to make good decisions. The other thing too is that most horse people are not taught how to read horse behavior very effectively. We're not taught how to read the subtle signs of stress. We're often taught that certain stress behaviors are just quirks or naughtiness or horses being disrespectful. So many horse people for years are taught to take certain horse behaviors massively out of context, and they don't learn where they're actually stemming from, and they also don't learn how to decipher the more subtle signs of stress. So then that sets these riders up to be injured as well. So what I want to say about this whole event is that it's dangerous for horse and rider. And like everything that I say about the horse community and my frustrations with the competitive world and like horse training and stuff, it's not just about the horses, it's also about rider safety because there's a lot of riders who die or become extremely injured. And what happened leading up to those events is largely preventable. And it's not to say that you can prevent every accident ever, even if it's not a freak accident and even if there's things that were done wrong. You can't prevent everything, but like if we had better education and a better understanding of horse behavior and just took more steps to try to make the show environments as low stress as possible for horses, we wouldn't see these events occur as often as they do. So I find that very frustrating because it's horrible for the horse and rider. And in this case, this would have been a really traumatic experience for the horse, obviously, but for all of the people at the show watching this, all of the horse's connections, the rider, this was a horrifically traumatic experience. I cannot imagine the absolute terror and anxiety that those people were feeling. And I say this, like, I don't agree with all the aspects that would have led the horse to getting to that competition or how the horse is probably trained, etc. But those people who had the horse still probably loved this horse in their own way and love animals in their own way. Even if you don't even know the horse, witnessing an animal be that traumatized and stressed and have that catastrophic of an accident is horrendous. I don't wish that on anybody. And so the trauma from that, like even for the people who survived this event, the trauma from that is very scary. The other thing to note is that a horse getting loose and getting that panicked and out of control is a liability to everybody that is in that area. That is like, it's a liability to everybody who was riding at the show because other horses could have gotten stressed and started to behave dangerously too and put riders at risk, and maybe they did. So it's a liability and danger to everybody involved, not just the people involved with that specific horse. All of that aside, a horse who is emotionally regulating and is not completely frantic in such a high level of terror that they stop thinking, they are not going to run full speed into a concrete wall unless they are literally blind and they cannot see it. You know, like that level of blind panic is a horse that truly feels like their life is so at risk that they are running for their lives. They are fucking terrified. There's nothing that can get through to them at that point. If a person had tried to stand in front of that horse to block it off, at that point, there would be a pretty high chance that they would get plowed over. Because when they're in that level of fear as a flight animal, they are literally just desperate to escape whatever the stressor is. And now the problem is that since this is like a trigger stacking issue, there would have been like one final stressor that caused the horse to finally pop off like this. But the show environment itself is probably a learned stressor for the horse after however many years of having it be likely a stressful environment. So now they're running, but they cannot escape the stressors and they just keep mounting. And then the running itself is frightening for the horse too. And then I would wager that the horse had all four shoes on. So when they're running around on concrete, they would be sliding, they would be sending up sparks, they wouldn't have good traction. And then that would be adding another stressor as well. So it's this combination of so many different factors that created this really horrific end result. But what I want to stress the most is that a horse that is not in a very, very extremely high level of stress and fear is not going to bolt in the way where they are so out of control, cannot be stopped, bolt for as long as it sounds as horse did, and then run into a stone wall. Horses that lose their riders at shows, likely to run around. Like even horses who are relatively accomplished show horses, if something scares them and they lose their rider and they're still scared, they're probably going to run around and flag their tail, especially if like other horses are feeding off of it. But they're not as likely to go blasting around at a flat gallop and in a way where they're not even watching out for their surroundings. It'll be more likely to bring them down from that stressor and handle it and not have it escalate to that extent. So it's not even the fact that I'm saying horses should never bolt and that if they bolt, it's a failure of the entire industry because like stuff can happen as flight animals and people aren't perfect beings. So yeah, stuff happens, but it's the degree of anxiety and like the severity of this issue that is such a problem. The other thing too with this issue is that the horse industry has a tendency to refer to any time a horse is really injured or killed in competition as a freak accident. And it's literally almost every time. It'll be a freak accident or a tragic event or an unfortunate accident. And there's language that is used to downplay what is actually going on and to imply that there was no way to avoid it. And given the facts that we have so many studies nowadays with elite sport horses showing like this, the levels of stress that the average upper level sport horse is experiencing and how high levels of stress and like discomfort and just general, like that there's welfare concerns specifically pertaining to stress. And then we also have studies that show that stress horses are more dangerous to people. So the research is there to suggest there's need for change. So to say that this is a freak accident and imply that it's something that's unavoidable when the industry is really not putting any work in to address the factors that make these type of occurrences more likely is really frustrating because essentially what the purpose of writing it in that way and like the media depicting it that way is to evade any and all accountability for the industry and make up excuses to justify why they don't put the effort into trying to make changes in competition for the betterment of horse welfare. And I find that exceptionally frustrating. It's not that you expect perfection from people or that it's to vilify people who these things happen to and say that there's terrible people who don't care about their horses. It's none of that. It's the fact that these things happen and then people just kind of go, wow, that's so awful, but then shrug it off and go, oh, well, there's nothing we could do about it. That like stuff happens. Horses are flight animals. They do stuff out of nowhere. Like this happens. It's just a thing. But no, it happens at a rate and a severity that we could, at the bare minimum, make less frequent and less severe. At the bare minimum. It's not about completely avoiding every and all accident that is possible, but the level of accidents and like the severity of them, we could at least make it less like potent and less severe if we put some efforts in. And even in the event, let's pretend we couldn't. That's not true, but let's pretend. At least putting an effort in to try things to see what makes a difference. That is something to take note of. It is something where it shows that people are trying. The fact that there is no real effort being put in place to make any meaningful changes, despite all the research and information we show the need for them, is inexcusable. And we as an industry cannot actually pretend that we care to prevent or avoid these types of occurrences if we're not actually going to do the hard work of putting in practices and reforms to avoid the environments and situations that lead up to this. Because an upper level show horse should be able to manage the show environment without it escalating to that degree of anxiety. And all that aside too, like the prize giving ceremonies in general for upper level sport horses, a lot of them, the horses are highly stressed and you can see them dancing around, reacting, bucking, whatever. I did a post about Kalinka a few years ago and how she was behaving in the award ceremony where she had to be led in with two people because she was leaping around and freaking out. And people laugh at and go like, oh, like they're so proud of themselves for winning, blah, blah, blah. And they anthropomorphize these behaviors, make light out of them, don't actually look at them for what they are. And it means that you can't properly deal with them if you're making light out of why the horse is reacting that way and just doing ha ha ha. And then also when you get mad at people for saying that they are stressed, because in that situation, Carl Cook freaked out at me and said a bunch of really kind of like backhanded degrading stuff about me for saying like that horse is stressed and saying that like we shouldn't normalize it at that level of competition. And in the post that I did about this, I even said like how much I respected him and liked him as a horse person, but still was pissed off about me having the audacity to suggest that his horse, who needed two handlers to walk into the competition or into the prize giving ceremony, was stressed, even though she was leaping around and was very clearly stressed. And that's the problem is people get angry when you point out the reality of these situations because they want to be in the dark. They don't want to make the changes. The industry wants to keep people ignorant, and people within it want to keep ignorant to an extent, whether they're consciously aware of that or not, because it is painful to accept the reality and look at all of these stressed horses and how often we see these types of behaviors and actually have to look at it through the lens of like, wow, this much of the industry and this many horses that I see at shows are actually like exhibiting stress signs, because it just highlights a very, very huge issue, because it is a huge portion of the industry where we see these types of things occurring at horse shows. It is so, so common. So how common it is partly why I think people don't want to accept these things, because they don't want to have to come to terms with the fact that the problem is as big as it actually is. And I get it, because I used to be one of those people, and it is really hard to come to terms with the fact that we often do things to horses that are damaging to their welfare, even though we do love them. And again, like, this isn't really a statement to say that people are maliciously doing these things to their horses. There is a huge lack of education, and it makes it really easy for people to cause harm to animals that they love, whether they intend to or not. With that said, I do think that there's enough people involved where they are doing it intentionally from the standpoint of they know that what they're doing could damage welfare, and instead of addressing it, they're trying to sweep it under the rug, basically bully any advocate who tries to talk about it into silence and not properly address it. And like, those types of people are more than likely like the people involved with the FEI, media organizations, etc. And the reason being is that these type of entities are profiting a lot from people who are utilizing the very types of practices that are being criticized, and they want to continue lining their pockets without actually having to lose money by bettering welfare, because by making changes and reforms in competition and changing the way that we view the horse industry, it would require a lot of people at the very pinnacle of the sport to completely do an overhaul on their practices, and they don't want to. These people want to continue doing what it is that they are doing, and they don't want to have to consider about how their actions impact horses. And there's also this sense of entitlement where the people not only want to continue doing these practices, even if there's very credible info showing that they're damaging, they want to be able to do these practices without any criticism and without having to feel guilty about it, which is a very entitled outlook on life. And as someone who grew up, like, for part of my life, like, my family was pretty well off and affluent, and I got handed things for like the first 10 years of my life before shit hit the fan. Like, I know how easy it is when you have money to throw at things. And I think part of it too is that a lot of the people at the top of the sport do have a fair amount of money and have at least grown up like upper middle class. This isn't to say everyone. I know that there's some people who are poor that made their own way, but they are outliers. A lot of these people at minimum are upper middle class, if not exorbitantly wealthy. And I think that the other aspect of this problem is that we have a facet of people that isn't used to being told no, and that is used to things coming relatively easy to them, and that is used to being able to essentially like buy their way to an easier life. Again, this doesn't mean that they don't have to work hard, doesn't mean that they're not talented, doesn't mean that they're not worthwhile individuals, but money does make things easier, especially when we're talking about an industry where it costs thousands of dollars each week to show, and that is just for like entry fees and being there. So money helps. So there's this sense of privilege and entitlement that this group of people has. And then when they're called out by people that they view as like peasants and lesser than, and that aren't show people and aren't in that crowd, they get very angry about it, and they don't want to have to come to terms with it. And part of that anger, I think, is rooted in internalized guilt. There is a part of them that knows that there's some level of merit to what is being said, and they're not ready to come to terms with it. And it's a really painful thing to come to terms with. And like, again, I get it, because I did the same thing. It is really hard to come to terms with. It does suck. It's a super uncomfortable, unlearning process. And it sucks to have to acknowledge the fact that you have harmed animals that you loved unintentionally, especially because it does feel like a certain level of injustice, because you have been taught to do these things by people that you trusted as professionals from a very early time in your riding career. So it feels like an injustice. It feels very unfair. And it's easier to just like go to what is comfortable and go into a state of denial and cognitive dissonance. It's an easier thing to do. But all that aside, like the way we manage things in the horse world and like what we're normalizing in the horse world is also damaging to people, like not just from like a physical danger level. It's definitely that too, but also like mentally. Like it is encouraging people to suppress their emotions. It encourages people to be more violent in their perspective on horses as well as other people. It causes them to dehumanize other people. For example, like people who view things differently than them. It results in a lot of behavioral issues in people that I think are otherwise avoidable, because when you learn how to be more compassionate and understanding towards an animal that has no voice, it becomes abundantly easier to become more compassionate towards yourself and other human beings, and also to take behavior less personally, be it your horse exhibiting the behavior or another human. When you learn to understand that there's like an underlying motivation behind every behavior, you learn that a lot of the stuff that people do is not personal to you, and also that what your horse does is not personal to you. They're not out to get you, you know, that everyone's fighting their own battles and blah, 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 blah. So my perspective is that like the way the horse world is, we could make some really meaningful, positive changes if we just started to self-reflect more and actually address the elephant in the room. However, the money-making entities that have all the control of the media and all the control of the rules and the show rings, etc., they're not going to go down without a fight. So it's essentially going to be a situation where we have to make them, and that's going to take like outside pressure. It's going to take monetary loss. And it's going to take people being really loud and demanding of it, because they don't want to have to change their profit margin. They don't want to have to make changes that seek to dismantle the structure of the situation that they've built. So it's going to take pressure. The last thing I want to note regarding the situation is that I did a written post on this, and like the article that is out about this incident with the dressage horse was written by Euro Dressage. I'm pretty sure it's the only media platform that has really published something on it that I've seen, at least. Anyways, I did an article where I referenced their article and highlighted some stuff that they said in that article and screenshotted like their webpage with the name of their headline attached and the link. So it's perfectly allowed from a copyright standpoint. Anyways, they messaged me about it and were kind of like, were you there though? How do you know the horse was scared? And I was like, well, like, can you tell me why exactly a horse would run full speed into a stone wall, if not because of fear? It didn't answer that. They then reported my post and it got automatically taken down by Instagram. They reported it for copyright infringement, despite the fact that you absolutely are allowed to reference public news articles. It is fair use. I did not plagiarize their article. I did not say I wrote it, but they decided that, I guess, apparently their news is only available to be quoted and shared by people who agree with their perspectives, which is fucking shitty, shoddy, fake journalism. It breaks the journalistic code of conduct, where it should just be about sharing the truth, sharing the reality of a situation, and just allowing people to read it and be informed. Obviously, most media is not like that, but that is what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be without bias, regardless of what the journalists writing the articles' perspectives are on the situation. It's supposed to be completely unbiased, which isn't necessarily fully possible, because I think there's always a little bit of bias, whether people are aware of it or not, because it's your perspective and like how you see and witness these events or whatever. But that's what journalism is supposed to be. But what they did is they tried to, one, DM me first and essentially like intimidate me into deleting it. And basically like, were you there? How do you know? You took it out of context, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, no, I didn't take it out of context. If you read their article, they literally say the horse was out of control, bolting full speed, continued to bolt, could not be stopped, jumped over a bunch of dressage fences, and then ran into a wall. If you read their description of that and can look me in the face and say, oh, that doesn't sound like it's a stressed or afraid horse, like, honestly, F right off. That it's just total bullshit. So I didn't take what they said out of context. I quoted their exact words and the exact article. I took the exact article and I quoted it and I shared my thoughts on it. But they had an issue with that, because the thoughts that I shared were about how these things are not freak accidents. And I took issue with the fact that their article called it a freak accident and made the implication that it could not have been avoided. The other thing I want to note is that a human femur is stronger than concrete and takes an exceptional amount of force to fracture and break. I would imagine a horse femur is about as strong as a human femur, if not stronger. Can't speak to that for sure, but I would imagine that's the case. So the amount of impact that the horse would have had to have to fracture its femur is horrific. And the amount of pain that that animal would have been in, especially after the initial emotional pain of being that afraid, horrific. Should not want any animal to go through that. And if there's anything we could do to prevent it, we should be talking about it. But the fact that discussions about prevention of these types of events are shot down and vilified by these major media corporations and organizations like the FEI and other upper level riders is exactly why the sport is never going to get ahead. They don't want to improve if having to improve means self-reflecting and feeling guilty about it. And that is horrendous. If there was even one little thing that could be said about this to reduce the likelihood of it reoccurring, people who are truly out to protect the horses should want that to happen, even if it makes them feel shitty about themselves for a little bit. One little thing. At the bare minimum, this could be investigated a little bit further for them to come to terms with and talk to equine welfare professionals and equine behavioral scientists and ask them what they believe might have caused this and what they could do to make changes to avoid these types of situations happening. If we are actually out to protect the horses, that should be a no-brainer. They could access in a heartbeat equine scientists that would be willing to speak out on this very event and suggest potential things that could be put into place to avoid these types of behaviors, what potential causes of this level of stress might be, and so on and so forth. They could be getting help from people who are well versed in the discussion on these types of things and be making really positive changes to follow that. Anyways, that's not happening. So it's really frustrating because there's just no excuse for it. It's really selfish and there's no way around it. A lot of the decisions we make for horses in competition are selfish. Competition itself is inherently selfish if we're being honest, because the horse doesn't really seek any benefit out of it. So if we're going to do it, we should be doing it in a way that's as safe and ethical as possible and that values the horse's emotional state as much as we do their physical state. And that's not happening. The other issue that I had with the Euro dressage article that I didn't mention is that if you open the article, the first 2/3 of the article are about the horse's accomplishments and how it won and how well it's been doing in the show ring and whatnot. And then the part about the freak accident is pretty brief and really doesn't take any accountability or talk about the fact that horses are flight animals and this was a fear response and that it's a tragic accident, but that is something that should be investigated further. Nothing about that. And my frustration about this is that a lot of the articles on horses who've died or become horrifically injured in competition will go on and on about the horses' accomplishments and how well bred they are, how talented they are, how much they've won stuff. And it's the horse doesn't give a fuck about that. Despite all of those accomplishments, it still didn't save them from this horrifically painful and scary death. And despite all those accomplishments, people are not really willing to consider ways that they could avoid those types of accidents and avoid those types of responses from horses and help them feel safer so that they don't escalate to that point. Because even if the horse had only gotten scrapes and road burn or whatever, it still would have been an instance where the horse was very, very scared. And that is not nice for their welfare either. They don't have to die or get really, really injured for something to be damaging and traumatizing to them. So it's frustrating. And it's how many freak accidents do we need to have each year before we admit the fact that they're not freak accidents, that there's certain contributing factors that are adding to the likelihood of them occurring that we continue to enable and allow to happen and that we're not looking far enough into. Even if those factors we're not aware of them, we're not looking into the causes of these situations enough and how we can make alterations to make them less likely to occur. And so it stops being a freak accident if we're deliberately looking the other way and not wanting to make changes. And that's another frustration of mine is that we're not looking to lessen the occurrence of any of these accidents. It's all about maintaining the status quo and kind of shrugging these off, having the news articles be really short, get buried, and not give a whole lot of publicity to these things and kind of just sweep it under the rug again and not have it be discussed. And that is not the type of attitude that we need to have if it's actually wanting to change. So anyways, I'm very disappointed in equestrian media. I already was, but I think it's freaking the hypocrisy and irony of a media publication whose entire existence is rooted in sharing information and news to the general public, for them to report me false flag my post as a copyright infringement for quoting their news article, which you're allowed to do. And doing so simply because they didn't like the context of like why I was sharing it. First of all, childish as hell. It's like, is this run by like 13-year-old like angsty teenagers or like adults that have not emotionally developed at all? Like what is going on? And secondly, it's just like a disgrace for a news article. Like I'm sorry, like no, I'm not sorry. I'm not sorry at all. Euro dressage, it's an embarrassment. Like you're a company that I would presume is run by people who are well established adults who are probably much older than I am myself at 28 years old. And you cannot take a 28-year-old saying freak accidents are usually avoidable if we actually look at the factors that lead up to them without throwing a little tantrum and reporting their post where they quoted an article and credited you. Like, it's like whiny piss baby bullshit. Like, I'm sorry, like, to be blunt like that. Not sorry to Euro dressage, sorry for people who don't like that, but it's like, cry me a freaking river. Don't be a news publication if you don't want people to share your article unless they agree with everything that you're saying and aren't going to say anything that makes you feel uncomfortable. Like, don't be a news publication then. Or it, like, don't, I don't like start a fucking podcast where you're sharing your own personal opinion then, you know, like don't be a public news organization that's covering the news and events that occur at competitions. If you're not prepared for people to be like, hey, like this event might have been avoidable. And like the other thing too, the how egocentric it is for humans to look at an event like this and go, oh, there's nothing that we possibly could have done to stop this from happening. It was totally out of our control. We do everything so perfectly and cautiously, and we're taking all the steps. There's nothing that we could have done. Fucking egotistical as hell. It's like, shut up. No one's perfect. Even in situations where it's a freak accident to the point where it would have been hard to avoid. In hindsight, you can usually look at things that if you had made minor alterations, that it might have been avoidable. Not always realistic to make those alterations. So this is not to shame people, but in hindsight, if you're looking at situations that you watched unfold in the moment that happened fast or really scary and tragic or whatever, if you look at them in hindsight, you're able to think more clearly and like reflect on what you would have done differently if you're a self-reflective person. So the fact that as an industry, we have all these people who are like, oh, like there's nothing we could have done. Like it's so unfair to say that there's something could have done. Horses are unpredictable flight animals, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, they are unpredictable to an extent, but we're also really bad at predicting them when there is a lot of predictability in why they respond the way they do. A stressed horse is going to behave like a flight animal. If we started to actually look at how prevalent horse stress was and, I don't know, address it, we would see less of these flight responses. So yeah, there's a certain level of unpredictability, especially if you take a flight animal, isolate the shit out of it, put it in a stall for like 18 to 24 hours a day, and then cart it off thousands of kilometers to a horse show where it's busy and around other stressed horses, and then put on restrictive equipment, consistently suppress its stress in training and punish it for a behavioral response or when it tries to communicate its discomfort. Like, yeah, it's going to be predictably unpredictable because you set up an environment where you have a highly stressed, afraid, and highly fit animal that is being put in a situation that is going to bring out the worst in it, especially when you haven't given it any coping skills and it's not getting species appropriate care. So yeah, there's a level of unpredictability, but it's a predictable unpredictability in my opinion. If you don't address problems, yeah, they're going to continue. So it's just a cop out. Like horses are flight animals. We won't be able to avoid every flight response, but we can reduce the severity of them and we can reduce the frequency of their occurrence by taking steps. But that won't happen when there's all these people who are like, oh, like my horse needs this harsh type of equipment and they are not looking at why they need that for control, like why their horse is so out of control. Or what in events like this, we're like, oh, it's a freak accident. There's nothing that could have possibly been done. They're not even looking for what could have been done differently. They're not even considering it because they've already decided that they don't want to have to reflect like that. They don't want to have to address the elephant in the room. So of course, there's not going to be anything that you can see that you could have done differently if you are committed to just basically always pissing your own ass and never looking at how you could have done things differently. And like that lack of humility that we see in the horse world and just like how egocentric so many of these organizations, these media outlets are and the riders that they cover are because they just want to protect their ego and their feelings to an extent far greater than they ever want to protect horses. We're not going to see these changes. And we have all these media outlets that are coddling full grown adults and not even nicely saying like, hey, there are factors that could have reduced the stress that might have led up to this instance and get like professionals to speak out on it because it's not about pointing fingers and having blame because the rider involved and the connections of the horse probably already feel bad enough. But if you can put out information and talk about and describe why these types of occurrences are likely to happen and how people can take steps to avoid them, you might help other riders who are in similar situations or who may find themselves in similar situations. And is that not worthwhile if it could even protect one horse and rider pair? Because this could have been a lot worse. If the rider hadn't bailed off and the horse crashed into that cement barricade, they both could have been dead or the rider could have been hospitalized. It could have been way, way worse than it was. So why are we going to continue to allow these incidents to pile up and continue to watch so many casualties to both horses and riders when there are things that we could be doing or at least testing to see if they do make a difference? And I don't know, like at least making an effort to try and make it safer. Like there are things that we could do, full stop. If they actually recruited equine behavioral professionals, equine welfare professionals, and put the exorbitant amount of money that organizations like the FEI are pulling in each year just towards some studies that are about improving sport horse competition welfare and reducing stress, and let the people running the experts running those studies conduct them without the bias being inflicted on them by the FEI, where there's incentives to try to cover up things that aren't going to be as nice and nicely reflective of the FEI, where there's going to be stuff that comes out where it's going to essentially force change by being like, yeah, this is wrong. If they cared enough about the horses, they would do that. But the reason why they don't want to put money into some of these studies and like these efforts is that they would be so damning to the current state of the industry, and that if they did that and then still continue to look the other way, they would look even worse than they already do. But the ability to look further into these things and the ability to make meaningful changes that will better the lives of horses and riders and keep everyone safer and make competition abundantly more ethical for the horses. The ability is there. They just don't want to. And again, like with the people in charge that are pulling the most amount of money and that control a lot of these media outlets and like are in control at the top of the FEI, they're business people. It's about business. It's not about the well-being of horses, and they don't care. But a lot of the riders, I do think, care about their horses. They've just been gravely misled and have had so many of these attitudes so normalized to them that they no longer see up from down. And it's really sad because all of these people, for the most part, probably started out as like horse loving kids. And they have been led so far astray by the insidious nature of the industry and how much of an echo chamber it is once you enter the competition realm, because so many people are doing things the same way and you see so much horse stress on a daily basis that it feels normal. And that then coming to terms with the fact that it is stress that you're seeing is hard, because then it requires admitting that virtually every horse you've ever laid hands on has been exhibiting stress behaviors. So I freaking get it, but it needs to change. And like, I believe in people's capacity to change. Like, this is the other thing. Like, I get accused of trying to vilify people and just like make them out to be bad people. And it's like, no, like I view it as separate. You can do bad things and make decisions that are harmful to other entities without doing it in a malicious way where your intent is to hurt. And I do think that that's what the vast majority of horse people are doing. They do things that are harmful to their horses, but their intent is not to deliberately hurt their horse. So you can do bad things without being like a bad person, but like ultimately we are all responsible for our individual growth. And if you continue to stagnate that growth and continue to engage in actions that are harmful to people and animals around you, you do deserve to be held accountable for that to an extent. And people can use that to reflect on your character because you've made a choice and your choices have outcomes. Your choices have like responses to them. It's not freedom from judgment or freedom from consequences just because you make these choices. So it's all of our responsibility to learn and grow. And especially if we really do love these animals, like love involves selflessness. If we're not willing to be selfless and do hard work for the betterment and well-being of animals that we claim to love, then we really need to reassess how selfish that love is, because it's like a toxic and abusive relationship of love then. Being in any type of relationship, be it like with humans or human and animal, where one side of the relationship is taking to the detriment of the welfare of the other side of that relationship, that is an abusive relationship, especially when there is a huge power imbalance. And there's no way around that. And even within human relationships, a lot of abusers were abused as children, and there's a story behind it. It's not to say that they just do it again out of sheer malice where they're like, I want to hurt people. It's toxic, ingrained behavior that they have learned from some place, and they are a broken person inside that needs healing in some capacity. And it is possible for them to heal, but it requires awareness and putting the work in, and then it's a desire to do better, and really like a focus on understanding the hurt you've caused and not putting more effort into protecting your feelings because it hurts to admit that you've hurt people or animals that you care about. And you can do that without being a bad person. I've done a lot of things to horses that are not acceptable and that I deeply regret and that I know caused harm to them. And it was not okay. And it was a compilation of like me being taught to do these things as kids, having trainers normalize it to me, having a very punishing and violent type of training methodology normalized to me and taught to me. And also being traumatized and frustrated and depressed and dealing with mental health issues and not knowing my identity myself and having all of these internal frustrations along with like how I had been taught to work with horses just pile up and then trigger stack me to the point where I'm more likely to engage in punishment. One, because it was what I was taught to do. Two, because I like almost always nearing being over threshold. So it did not take very much to set me off. Doesn't justify my actions, but it gives me a means of understanding why I did them, which makes it easier for me to forgive myself. And with everything I post, like I know I can be direct and I can be critical of like the status quo. And like the reason being now, like the bluntness is that like we've tried saying things nicely before and it's been so many years and there's just such little change. And I feel like things are actually getting worse in competition in a lot of ways. So I think that the moment has crossed for being like super like soft and sensitive towards people who are having like who are like in the power dynamic where they're pulling a lot of money and they're profiting a lot of it off of this and they have a lot of control. I don't really feel the need to coddle those people. I don't really feel the need to coddle people who are deliberately denying scientific research and don't want to accept the fact that like stalling horses for 18 to 24 hours a day is detrimental to welfare. I'm not going to lie to people just to make them feel more comfortable. If people are committed to ignorance, then they can continue to engage in that and not look at my stuff. They're not entitled to being ignorant of factual information and then also garnering my support for it. They're allowed to have their own opinions and thoughts and feelings, of course, but they're not entitled to me supporting those opinions and thoughts and feelings. And that's kind of where I've gotten to. And the reason why I continue talking about these things is because I do believe in people's capacity to change. I do believe in the capacity to appeal to people's compassionate and emotional side and eventually get through to them, even if it takes a while. Otherwise, I wouldn't do this. If I thought that all of these horse people were completely irreparable and that there was no way out for them, I wouldn't waste my time doing this because there would be no point because you can't reach people like that. I would be more fixated on just tanking the entire industry and doing a complete ban. But the reason why I'm pushing for a reform is that I do think that people have the capacity to reform. And I think the more smaller changes we start to make, people will start to see how much they better their horses' welfare along with how they feel about themselves. And it'll be reinforcing to the point where more people will get curious and want to engage in it. And we're already seeing this happen with how many more people are getting interested in reward-based training, science-based training, and more species-appropriate management styles. It is catching on more slowly than I would like it to, but it is catching on and people are being reinforced by how much better it makes them feel about themselves and all the problems in their horse that these seemingly minor changes can resolve. So it is happening. And I believe in people's capacity to change. I think certain people, especially when they make a lot of money and they profit a lot off of the way things are going to be harder to change and they're going to need to have that change forced by circumstance, be it the amount of criticism piling up to an extent where the industry socializes is at risk, which it already is and they don't care yet, or huge monetary loss to them. And those things can kind of go hand in hand. So where we're at in the horse world now is that if we want to continue ignoring the elephant in the room and downplaying events like this and calling them freak accidents and trying to make it out to be like there's nothing we could possibly do to make a difference, if we want to continue doing that, what I want people to understand is that commitment to withholding and like continuing the status quo without any change and any self-reflection or any research into how we could do things better, that commitment to that is going to come at the expense of the entire industry. If we double down and commit to not changing despite the growing bodies of evidence showing need for change and all of these events that are continuing to pile up to show that there's need for change, if we continue to double down and ignore all of those things, it is going to come at the expense of the industry social license because people who have not been indoctrinated into bias to the extent that the average horse person has are going to see all these things at face value, and they're going to be disgusted, and they have no incentive to save the horse industry. And they also don't see the redeeming qualities of most horse people because they're so far removed from the horse industry. So it's easier for them to vilify everyone and be like, nope, horse riding overall is bad. It cannot be done ethically. These people suck. There's no way to reform or repair this. And that's going to be what happens. And the reason being is that the stuff that gets platformed the most by these big media corporations is the stuff that is the most problematic from a welfare perspective. You don't see the guys who are not competing or who are competing at a lower level or doing things that are much slower and less exciting to watch because there's no explosives or really fancy movement, blah, blah, blah. Those people don't get platformed as much. If they did, there would be more stuff for people to see that would humanize and show the compassion that like horse people have rather than just making them seem like they're bad people that are irredeemable. So there needs to be changes put in place by us, and we need to start to platform the types of people who are doing things in the most ethical manner and who are being the most considerate of horses. And we also need to start deplatforming people who are not doing that. Stop giving them as many chances. Stop giving the FEI as many chances when they don't handle things, because they've made it super clear that certain people are untouchable by circumstance, or that they're only willing to actually sanction people once like unequivocal evidence comes out that is so damning that if they don't deal with it, it's going to tank their entire career and their entire system. So we need to make these changes, and we really need to focus on holding people more accountable, but also having enough compassion to realize that accountability isn't vilifying someone for forever to come. Judge them off of their actions and how they continually show up and who they show themselves to be on a continued basis. Don't judge them off of their past. If people are trying to make meaningful changes and they're trying to learn and they're trying to do better, that is the start of what we are trying to bring in change. They're trying to do better. They're becoming more self-aware. They're acknowledging where they've made mistakes, and they are looking for ways to do better by things. We can't vilify people for their past. I've had people try to do it to me where they're like, oh, well, you used to do X, Y, Z. Doesn't matter. The key word is used to. Growth is a good thing. Is everyone's preference then? Like the logic of people who do shit like that. Is your preference for people to be stubborn and double down into continuing to be as toxic and unhealthy as they were before, simply because it's what they were doing before? It doesn't make any sense. Doing something in the past, realizing it was wrong, and changing and committing to the growth of yourself is a very honorable thing to do. It is a really hard thing to do, but it is a really good and healthy thing to do, and it's to be encouraged and looked at with pride and understanding by the community, rather than a sign of inauthenticity because someone has changed from the person they used to be. Change is a good thing. I'm not at all the same person I was even like 3 years ago. I'm sure as heck not the same person I was a decade ago or in my early 20s or whatever. Like I'm not the same person because I've grown. I'm not going to be the same person in 2 years from now because I'm going to continue growing and changing and discovering my most authentic self as I grow and learn more things. And that is what everyone should do. You don't have to commit to being a certain way just because it's what you've done for a long time and just because there's other people in your life that uphold those same type of toxic mindset. You can set boundaries and you can walk your own path and you can do what feels comfortable and best for you. So I believe in the industry's capacity to change, but I do think we need to hold media corporations more accountable, along with big organizations like the FEI, USEF, every type of show organization available, and our upper level riders, because they don't have to be viewed as a terrible and bad abusive person. But for example, all the studies on hyperflexing showing how damaging it is. If these riders have access to these studies, which they do, and continue to ride their horses in ways that are proven to be damaging and then don't want to be called out for that or don't want that to reflect in how people feel about them, what they want to do is essentially be able to freely engage in behaviors that they know are harmful to their horse, but without judgment. And that's not fair. You're not entitled to do that. I would so respect a rider who had taught their horse in hyperflexion, who came out and say that I'm learning about equine biomechanics and how damaging hyperflexion is. And since the horse has been trained this way for years, it's going to take time to untrain that, but I'm really working hard to undo what was taught. I would respect that so much because there is a process of unlearning and doing things better. But if people were more candid about that journey of unlearning prior training methods and helping their horse unlearn, if they were more honest about that, one, it like humanizes them and like shows people that like it's an ever learning process, even when you're at the top of the sport. But two, it shows humility and they're showing that they want to do better. But there's a lot of people who don't want to have to come to terms with the validity of studies, and they also don't want people to view them differently when they continue to engage in harmful acts. The other thing too is that like these upper level riders serve as role models for so many people at the lower levels. So it has this trickle down effect where we have all these really well-meaning, enthusiastic, horse-loving youngsters who are learning how to do things in an unethical way from the beginning, because that is what's being platformed the most on big equestrian media, and what is being shown to be like the absolute goal that you should be chasing is like competing at the pinnacle of the sport. And that's like what the best riders are. That's what we're showing people. If we were to change that and platform people who were riding horses in a more ethical way and normalizing the idea of like a calm, responsive horse who isn't anxious and stressed, and using less equipment rather than more, and just like a more holistic, horse friendly approach overall. If we normalize that, that would also start to trickle down, and more people would have that normalized to them. And the more upper level riders that start to do that, like Brendan Wise is a great example. He's the guy that was doing Grand Prix stuff, or like meter 40, I think, bridleless with his horse, and it really beautiful rounds, extremely beautiful. Like literally looks like he could be riding like an equitation round, completely bridleless. Huge respect. Someone like that is kind of being like a breaker of a glass ceiling in a way, because he's showing people that it's possible. So the more people who do stuff like that, even in the absence of necessary rule changes, they're just going to show people that it's possible, and then it's going to create more change, which is a good thing. But we also need to hold these industries accountable for what they do, because also like what I want to continue reiterating is the horse industry as a whole is a multi-billion-dollar industry. The FEI is a multi-billion-dollar organization, and they are committed to being a business. They want to continue making money. And in doing so, they're not going to be making the most ethical decisions for the greater good of the horses, especially since the horses are conveniently voiceless and pretty easy to ignore the stress of unless people get louder. So we need to make these changes, but also be open to the fact that people can change. There's certain upper level riders that I'll be honest, I really don't like. Like I know I've talked a lot of shit about Clinton Anderson, and there's other people that I don't love the way they do things. But if they at any point decided to make changes and talked about it and talked about where they went wrong and stuff, I would have so much respect for them. It would make me like them so much more, and I would admire that aspect of them, because it's really hard to admit when you've done something wrong, especially when you've done it for a long time. And it's a very vulnerable and scary thing to do. So when people have the ability to do that, I respect them more. And like it would actually pique my interest enough where I could go and do essentially what looks like a 180, where there'd be this rider that I used to really not like and used to really condemn that I now really respect. And that's kind of the perspective that I look at everything through. I think a lot of people look at my content, especially written content, through a lens of rigidity because they feel personally attacked, and my posts bring out guilt in them, and I get that. But like, it's not about doing things perfectly. It's about trying to do things better and modernizing and getting better with the times, and just trying to hold ourselves more accountable and just make little changes to do better, and just becoming more and more self-aware. It's not about perfection, but like, I think that it's really a dangerous perspective to go, oh, it's either about trying to be perfect and people holding me to a degree of perfection, or not changing at all. Because I think that a lot of people view it as being perfect to suggest how we can improve horse stress overall. But it's just about making improvements. It's not about perfection. It takes time. It's not going to be an instantaneous thing, but it's about making improvement. Are people trying to improve or not? Are they trying to deflect away from things that bring to light issues that they might be having with their horse, or welfare issues with certain things in sport that they might respect? Are they trying? And that's what it's about. The last thing I want to say is that like with upper level riders, I also find that the people who love and support them, and this also happens with celebrities as a whole, they feel like if they like someone as a celebrity that they have to support everything they do. You don't. You can like them as a person, believe that they're a nice person, believe that they're well-intentioned, while recognizing the fact that they are still a human and they're not infallible, and that they will make mistakes, and there are things that need growth within them, that they're not always going to be right. Someone riding at a high level does not mean that they know everything. It does not mean that they're mistake free. It does not mean that they're doing everything ethically. And you can still appreciate who they are as a person and a human being without agreeing with everything that they do. And that goes for everyone, including myself. Like everything that I say, and when I share studies and whatnot, like I appreciate the fact that people like the fact that I share information, that they support it. That's great. But also I would encourage people to do their own continued learning rather than only getting it from my pages, Because like I said, there's always, whenever someone is sharing their perspective, it's always going to be from within their personal lens. So there's always going to be a degree of bias, even when they try to eliminate it. And that's why I offer sources for where people can find these studies on my website and where they can look up stuff and continue doing their own learning and reading, because they might read stuff that I've not come across yet, or they might read stuff and have a different perspective on it than me. And that's a really good thing, is we need more perspectives if we're going to try to make the most meaningful changes. So not being so like, not idolizing people to such an extent where you view them as infallible is also important. And it will help improve the world as a whole. Like I promise you that. So anyways, thank you for listening to this, everybody. I'm sorry that the audio is probably not going to be great because like I was just driving for a while. Don't worry, I wasn't texting and driving. Put the voice recording on first. Going to edit it. It's just on Bluetooth. But so it's not going to be the greatest, but I just really needed to get this off my chest. And I knew I wasn't going to be like sitting home and at my desk today. So this was the only option. And I was worried that if I didn't get it out, I would forget and then lose motivation and not do it. So I just wanted to do it. So thank you if you saw this all the way through. Let me know what you think. I always appreciate it when people share these, or even if they share quotes or sound bites from them. Credit is always appreciated if you do that. But it really, I like it a lot, because especially like the quotes and soundbite thing, for people who don't like me and wouldn't make it all the way through my podcast, they might see something that piques their interest and causes them to look further into some things, whether it's what I say or what other people say, or like the studies and the situation in general. So that's really helpful. It also helps me continue to support what I do, as does like shopping in my store, subscribing to Patreon, purchasing any of my webinars. I also have like a PayPal tip jar if people just want to do a one-time thing. All of that stuff really helps, because to be honest, like being invested in welfare and like doing things in a slow, horse-friendly way, it's not as profitable. I made way more money training as a general rule when I wasn't doing things as ethically, when it was more fast paced, and it burnt me out and it was really mentally unhealthy for me, which is why I'm taking on less clients now too, because I've just felt that a lot of clients, even if they start out wanting to do the right thing, a lot of them pressure you. So I'm trying to only source clients that are like very much on the same page as me and want to take the time it takes to fix issues. And it's taken a major step back from training, especially when the training is centered around like producing show horses in a profitable way. And like even with my project horses, like I'm not going to make much money off of them. Like I'll probably just break even or slightly more, because I'm not training them fast enough anymore. It's not happening fast enough, because I'm going more at the horse's pace and also at the pace that I need to do mentally to show up the best that I can. So it's less profitable to do things this way, because also like even training videos, my videos are a lot more boring. So not eliciting big reactions from horses, and people don't find it as entertaining to watch. It gets less views and thereby less ad money. My YouTube also got hacked and it's taken a major hit. And since my videos have gotten more boring over the years, because again, there's less reactions, there's less money involved. But like, I don't want to sell out. And like, I burnt out so badly when I was selling out to an extent to build my business and build a reputation and get experience, whether I realized that at the time or not. And it was really impactful to my mental health, and it was really not good. So I've taken a big step back from that. And that's also why like I'm doing more online stuff like the store and whatnot and stuff like that, rather than doing as much training, just because it's healthier for me. And I'm still recovering from the burnout that resulted in from what I was doing. So everyone that like supports the podcast or any aspect of my business, I appreciate it immensely, because this is largely like a thankless job. And the path that I've gone down has resulted in me inevitably, like at least for the time being, I don't think it's gonna be forever, taking a hit to my profits when it comes to like the horse training aspect part, which is why like the store and like and like the book that I'm writing and like any passive income is a good thing. So anyways, if you're interested in supporting my stuff, I'll leave all the links down below. You can also check out the first book that I wrote if you want to read about the journey that I've had like through changing my horsemanship practices and just doing things differently and like my personal trauma and all that stuff. It's called The Other Side of Horsemanship. If you go to my website, milestoneequestrian.ca, you can see where to buy it, or you can just look it up. But I think that's a really good way if people want to look at like me specifically and like what aspects of my life I feel led to me training horses the way I did initially and what ultimately led to that change. That's a really good book that kind of encompasses the entire process of that journey, and it's pretty candid. I'm also working on another book. I got signed by a publishing company, so that will hopefully be completed by either August or December is my deadline, but I want to try to complete it before the end of the summer, and I'm hoping to do a spring release. So it's going to be released come spring 2025 or fall 2025. So stay tuned for that. Working really hard on that, and I'm excited to share it with you guys. So anyways, thank you for listening. Don't forget to check the links down below in the description of this podcast. And yeah, please let me know your thoughts. I really appreciate it. Have a great day, everyone, and happy trail.